Greetings once again, gentle viewers. I spoke last time about the promise of the humble atom that science fiction in the 50s liked to present, and of course of the unintended problems that could arise. Now, of course, these days we're perfectly aware of the danger that radiation poses to living beings, but back in the 50s, a little radiation could perhaps be beneficial. Surely using radiation on foodstuffs couldn't cause any problems, right? Well, not really any big ones, anyway. Maybe. What's the theme for this month again?
Beginning of the End was brought to us by one Mr. Bert I. Gordon, a familiar name to anyone familiar with the Mystery Science Theater 3000 program. Mr. Gordon was responsible for a number of big something or other movies, the most famous of these being The Amazing Colossal Man and its sequel, War of the Colossal Beast, the latter of which was featured on the aforementioned MST3K. This film was also featured on MST3K, a fate which could only improve this stock footage fest. We start where quite a few 50s movies started, with two teenagers in a car making out. This romantic rendezvous is quickly interrupted by the off-screen arrival of something that makes the girl scream and exits our teenage lovers. Later, a police car comes across the overturned car of the teenagers. Turns out one of the teenagers is from the nearby town of Ludlow, so one of the officers is off to Ludlow to see if they can find out anything about the teenagers. Alas, when he gets there, the entire town has been flattened by some mysterious force. Cut to the next day, and a female reporter, one Audrey Ames, comes across the roadblock that the army has set up overnight. Audrey is told to turn back, but being a reporter of the intrepid girl variety, she simply goes to the commander's HQ and whines at him for a bit until he agrees to let her see Ludlow after he's gone to see the town for himself. Meanwhile, Audrey gathers some background on this potentially new story. She thinks radiation might have something to do with what happened to Ludlow, so she makes some calls, from her car phone no less, and finds out that the only facility anywhere nearby that's dealing with radiation is a facility being run by the Department of Agriculture.
Second time those chaps have been on the show. I should start charging them for advertising.
Anyway, Audrey heads over to the agriculture facility and finds in order a deaf mute, tomatoes the size of pumpkins, and Peter Graves. Of the three, Graves proves to be the most interesting. He also drops a bit of foreshadowing.
Last summer it was caterpillars, and after that it was grasshoppers by the drove.
Alas, other than Graves and the tomatoes, there isn't much here for Audrey, so she heads back to Army HQ to see if the commander is back from Ludlow yet. After a bit of arguing, the commander agrees to let Audrey have a look at the flattened town, and we get our first sight of the stock footage that this movie uses heavily. In this case, I'm fairly certain that it's stock footage of the aftermath of a tornado. At any rate, it turns out that there was another mysterious flattening not too far from Ludlow about 3 months before. So it's back to the Department of Agriculture facility to see if they know anything about it. They do know a little, so all three of them, Graves, Audrey, and the deaf-mute assistant, head out to a grain storage barn that seemingly exploded without anyone knowing about it. Of course, it didn't explode, and we find out what did flatten the barn and the town. It was giant grasshoppers. The deaf-mute can't hear the rather them-like noise that the grasshoppers are making, so he's done for, but Graves and Audrey escape and run off to tell the army what happened. They're met with a perfectly reasonable amount of skepticism, but Graves does manage to convince the commander to grab some men and go to the barn to check things out.
Now, point of order here. Graves calls the giant insects locusts, but they're pretty clearly grasshoppers. The two are related, though. In fact, locusts are a subspecies of grasshopper. The biggest difference between them is that locusts swarm and grasshoppers don't.
Back to the movie. After wandering around a bit, the army is attacked by the superimposed grasshoppers and forced into retreat. Back at Army HQ, the commander calls out the National Guard, but that's not nearly going to be enough, so it's off to Washington for what IMDb charmingly calls the standard obligatory insect film. Sadly, this isn't enough to convince the brass. However, a phone call informing them that the Illinois National Guard has been wiped out does the trick quite nicely. Back in Illinois, a defense line is set up outside of Chicago. Sadly, stock footage can't stand up to superimposed grasshoppers, and said grasshoppers begin to attack Chicago and its suburbs. It seems that the only solution to the problem might be a nuclear bomb, because that certainly won't cause other problems. There may be a scientific solution to the problem, however, and Graves convinces the general to give it a try. What Graves is going to do is mimic the sound of the locust queen and use that to lure the grasshoppers into Lake Michigan. In order to make sure that they've got the right frequency, they're going to need a live specimen, so it's out into the city to find one. They quickly do, and it's back to the lab to start work. These things take time, though, and soon the general arrives to inform Graves and his team that the bomber carrying the bomb is on its way. Graves pleads for a little more time and gets an hour and a half. Fortunately, that's just enough time to get the right frequency. The general heads out in a boat that will broadcast a signal to the grasshoppers to get them in the lake, while Graves lures them towards it by sending out the signal on land. It works, and the grasshoppers come streaming into the now abandoned city of Chicago. Of course, it can't really be that easy. The general's boat seems to be having a bit of a problem, which means that Graves is going to have to buy him some time, which means there's a lot of shooting at superimposed grasshoppers, and grasshoppers falling off a picture of the building that Graves is in. They do get the general's boat working again, and all of the grasshoppers are lured into the lake, where they drown and presumably disappear, and the boat heads back in, and roll credits.
And that was Beginning of the End. And what do I think?
So much stock footage. I know that this is something that Bird Eye is known for, but there's just so much of it in this movie. I will say this though, while the movie does have a slow start, once the grasshoppers show up, things really get moving. As for the acting, well, Graves isn't bad, neither is the rest of the cast really, but none of them have the presence that Graves has, which makes them come off a little flat. And finally, there's the special effects. Well, again, it was the 50s. They just didn't have the technology to make the grasshoppers look really good. That, or But I just didn't want to shell out for something that looked a little better.
Overall, if you like big bug movies, you could do worse than this one. Like, perhaps our next outing. Speaking of which, does anyone know how to get rid of mantises?